This is the unbelievable story of how an $8 Jheri curl kit bought a piece of Major League Baseball. In 1989, inside a Texas boardroom, Comer Cottrell wrote a check for $500,000 and became the first black man to ever own part of a major league team, the Texas Rangers, standing shoulder to shoulder with George W. Bush. Every dollar in that check had come from a home hair kit mixed in a Dallas warehouse. This is how the Jheri curl built a fortune: a baseball team, a college campus, and a legacy that outlived the style itself. But behind the glamour was a man who refused to accept no from the military, from the beauty industry, and from a segregated world that had never planned on making room for him. This is the story the Jheri Curl King never told the world. Chapter 1. The Curl King. To understand how a black man from Mobile, Alabama forced his way into a major league boardroom, you first need to understand the Jim Crow South he was born into, a world that had already decided Comer Cottrell wasn't going anywhere. Born December 7, 1931, Comer learned how to survive before he ever learned how to run a business. But along the way, he picked up an eye for the single crack in a wall built to keep him out. That instinct came from his father, an insurance salesman who used to take young Comer along on client visits. By age 9, Comer was already running his own little hustle with his brother, selling rabbit furs and meat door to door around the neighborhood. He briefly attended the University of Detroit before leaving to join the Air Force during the Korean War. He rose all the way up to first sergeant, managing a post exchange out on the island of Okinawa. It was there, thousands of miles from home, that he ran straight into the same wall he thought he'd left behind. About a fifth of the men on his base were black, and the shelves carried nothing for their hair. No oils, no conditioners, nothing built for the texture a fifth of his own base actually had. He brought it up to his superiors. They told him, flat out, there just wasn't a need for that. He didn't buy that answer. He tucked it away and carried it home. That refusal to sit down when a room full of white men told him no ended up shaping nearly every big decision of his life. A hair product, a baseball team, a whole college campus. Nobody else wanted to save. After leaving the service in 1954, Cottrell landed in Los Angeles and worked his way up at Sears Roebuck. Then in 1968, a friend talked him into finally betting on that gap he'd spotted back on Okinawa, instead of waiting around for someone else to fill it. With $600 and a broken typewriter, Cottrell and his brother James started mixing a strawberry-scented oil sheen for afro hairstyles, going door to door to sell it to salons around Los Angeles. And by 1970, they'd officially founded Proline Corporation. He marketed the company as a black-owned business that actually understood black hair, which was as much a mission statement as it was an ad line. Being a black business owner back then meant dealing with friction most people never had to think about. People would call his bank just to check that he was even real before they'd sit down and talk business with him. But by 1973, Cottrell had already crossed his first $1 million in sales, all off a strawberry-scented oil and a route of salons no outside investors needed, which told him the gap he'd spotted on that base in Okinawa was every bit as big as he thought it was. Still, the product that would turn a modest oil sheen company into the kind of fortune that buys you a stake in Major League Baseball hadn't even been invented yet. Now, here is the most intriguing part. Chapter 2. The $8 box that broke the bank. The style itself wasn't even Cottrell's invention. It belonged to a hairdresser and chemist named Jheri, who'd built a two-step chemical process into a glossy wash-and-wear alternative to a full relaxer. By the early 80s, it was already on the heads of Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie, more of a status symbol than a hairstyle. But getting that look meant a trip to the salon, easily $200 to $300, plus touch-ups every few weeks as the new growth came in. That put it way out of reach for most black families living paycheck to paycheck. Cottrell looked at that math and saw the same kind of opening he'd spotted in Okinawa. He hired a cosmetic chemist to build a formula regular people could use at home. One solution to soften the hair, a second to lock in the curl, and he spent months testing it until it held the pattern without the burning and breakage that ruined the cheap knockoffs. In 1979, he packaged it as the Proline Curly Kit, and the timing could not have been sharper. As a brutal recession squeezed American households in the early 80s, that $8 box did the exact same job as a $300 salon visit. Brothers James and Sherman Willis, who ran a black cosmetics distribution company called Willis Beauty Supply out of Columbus, Ohio, could barely keep the curly kit on their shelves during those recession years. And a big chunk of their own business boom traced right back to that one product moving through their warehouse. The style spread so fast it became actual pop culture shorthand, showing up on Michael Jackson's 1982 Thriller cover and on artists like Eazy-E and Ice Cube not long after. Forbes eventually called it the biggest single product ever to hit the black cosmetics market. Cottrell's own explanation stayed pretty simple. He told the Dallas Observer that he and his team looked at the curl process and just saw a process regular people could handle themselves, no stylist required. Within the first year, Proline's annual sales jumped from around $1 million to nearly $10 million, and they followed it up with a children's version called the Kitty Kit, a milder formula for younger scalps that pulled in a whole new generation of customers without stepping on the original product. International licensing deals followed too, in Nigeria, Kenya, Trinidad, even Taiwan, turning an American recession product into a genuinely global brand within just a few years. In 1980, with the business outgrowing its LA facilities and Dallas sitting closer to its biggest customer base, Cottrell moved Proline Corporation to Texas. It lowered his operating costs, put him closer to the political and business circles that would soon hand him the strangest investment of his entire career. Chapter 3. The Ballpark Buy-In. By the late 80s, Cottrell had become one of Dallas's most visible black businessmen, a rare black Republican in a business world that had almost no black faces in it at all, known around the city for a Proline plant that had grown into one of the biggest black-owned manufacturing operations in the whole Southwest. In 1989, that visibility landed him in a room with a Texas oil man named George W. Bush, who was pulling together a group of roughly 70 investors to buy the Texas Rangers for a reported $86 million. Cottrell wrote a check for $500,000 and became a limited partner. He described that meeting in pretty blunt terms later on. Bush came to his office wanting a genuinely diverse ownership group and told him straight up he'd be his black partner, Afro-American, alongside a roster of Jewish investors and a string of Bush's old Yale connections, including oil investor William DeWitt Jr. and financier Richard Rainwater. Cottrell wasn't exactly sentimental about why the future president wanted him at that table either, pointing out that Bush brought plenty to the deal just by being the sitting president's son and a candidate for governor, since everybody wanted to know him. This wasn't baseball glamour for Cottrell. He told his then-wife Isabel exactly what the investment actually was, saying, "I'm not investing in baseball, I'm investing in the president." That bet paid off on both sides. Bush's own stake started small, just 2% for around $606,302, most of it borrowed, with a built-in escalator clause that eventually grew his share to over 11% once the other partners got their money back. By 1994, the ownership group had worked out a new $165 million stadium deal with the city of Arlington, one financed largely through public bonds, which dramatically boosted the franchise's own resale value down the line. When Tom Hicks bought the team for $250 million in 1998, Bush personally walked away with close to $15 million in profit. Cottrell's own return was smaller, but shaped exactly the same, a $3 million profit on his original $500,000 stake. He never pretended the deal was about civic goodwill on Bush's part, rather than smart use of a diverse investor list. He'd sat in enough rooms by then to know exactly what got him that seat. He said so, without any bitterness in his voice, just a businessman reading the situation for exactly what it was. Still, it made him the first black person to ever hold an ownership stake in a Major League Baseball team, a distinction that had nothing to do with hair care and everything to do with the fortune hair care built. He didn't stop at just writing the check either, using his position afterward to push publicly for more minority hiring in front offices and team management across the league, a fight that outlasted his own time as an owner by decades. It's genuinely the strangest sentence in his whole biography. A Jheri curl kit funding a piece of a baseball franchise, and it still sounds made up even though every number in it is a matter of public record. It's not even the most surprising thing his money went on to build. Chapter 4. Buying back a college. In 1988, Bishop College, a historically black school, founded back in 1881 and later relocated to a 131-acre campus in Dallas, that had once enrolled close to 2,000 students at its peak, closed its doors entirely. A financial scandal costed its accreditation and its eligibility for United Negro College Fund support, and alumni and faculty were left scattered with nowhere to call home. The campus just sat there empty, a symbol of exactly how fragile black higher education can be once the money runs out, until Cottrell stepped in. In 1990, he bought the Bishop College campus at auction for $1.5 million and handed it over to Paul Quinn College, a struggling AME school in Waco that was losing students to nearby Baylor and the newly integrated Texas public universities. With extra support from corporate sponsors like Frito-Lay and Cottrell's own Proline, Paul Quinn moved onto its new 132-acre home in September 1990. The school opened its first semester in Dallas with 1,020 students, instantly becoming the only HBCU in the whole Dallas-Fort Worth area, a status it still holds today. It was the kind of gift that quietly reshaped an entire region's access to black higher education, but Cottrell built more than just a real estate deal into it. The Isabel and Comer Cottrell Student Union building still carries his name on that campus today, a small physical reminder of a much bigger act. Years later, the same campus went on to build the W.E. Overme Farm, turning unused athletic fields into a working farm feeding a food desert in southern Dallas, growing produce for a neighborhood that had gone without a real grocery store for years, an outgrowth of the same kind of community self-reliance Cottrell bet on when he wrote that first check. That same civic instinct pulled him into Dallas politics too, where he became the first black member of the powerful Dallas Citizens Council, a group made up of CEOs from the city's 80 largest companies who had never once let a black member in before him. He later used those same connections to help elect Ron Kirk as the city's first black mayor in 1995, and he did that as a lifelong Republican working to elect a Democrat, which he treated as completely consistent with everything else he'd built in Dallas rather than any kind of contradiction. Cottrell's money was never just sitting in a bank account earning interest. It kept getting redirected into institutions that Black Dallas either needed saved or built from nothing, the same refusal to accept a closed door that had followed him since a supply room in Okinawa. Chapter 5. The Second Generation. Cottrell ran Proline for 3 decades before deciding it was time to cash out. In 2000, he sold the company to Alberto Culver, in a deal reported at between $75 and $80 million, turning what started as $600 and a broken typewriter into one of the largest sales of a black-owned company in American history. That figure made the Texas Rangers' profit look small by comparison, even though the baseball deal was the one that made him a historical first. He stepped back from day-to-day operations once the deal closed, but the hair care instinct he'd built into his family didn't retire with him. His daughter, Renee Cottrell Brown, had already developed Just For Me, a gentler at-home relaxer built specifically for children, blending chemical relaxers with natural ingredients like sunflower oil and shea butter, and cutting the processing time down to around 10 or 15 minutes so young girls wouldn't have to sit through the same long chemical process their mothers once did. It became a drugstore staple through the 1990s under the Proline umbrella her father had built, complete with instructional cassette tapes and celebrity endorsements aimed at a whole generation of black mothers doing their daughters' hair on Sunday mornings. That entrepreneurial thread stretched into a third generation. Renee's own daughter, Autumn Yarborough, went on to launch New Standard, a hair care line built around a product called HydraSilk, carrying the family's business instincts into a completely different era of the black beauty market. One now shaped by ingredient transparency and natural formulations, rather than the chemical relaxers her grandfather and mother built careers on. That shift mattered more than it might sound. Research published decades after Just For Me first hit shelves eventually linked some relaxer formulas common across the industry to health risks, including uterine cancer, a finding that helped push forward exactly the natural hair pivot Autumn's own brand was built around. 3 generations of the same family kept building products for the same underserved customer Cottrell first noticed on an Air Force base in Okinawa. Proof the gap he spotted as a young serviceman was never really about one product. It was about a market nobody else had bothered to take seriously. Once Cottrell showed his family how to see it, they kept finding new ways to serve it long after he'd cashed his own check, each generation adjusting the formula to whatever the culture around black hair happened to demand at the time. What started as a strawberry-scented oil in a rented Los Angeles space had turned into a three-generation blueprint, one that other Black-owned beauty brands would end up studying and following for decades to come. Chapter 6. When the curl died. The style that built Cottrell's fortune didn't survive nearly as long as the money it generated. By the mid-90s, the Jheri curl had already become a punchline, its greasy pillowcases and constant activator spray turning into exactly the kind of cultural shorthand comedians like Keenan Ivory Wayans and In Living Color built entire sketches around, using the same activator bottle Cottrell's own kit had put on drugstore shelves a decade earlier. Hollywood kept the joke going well past the style's actual popularity, from the Soul Glow dynasty in Coming to America to Samuel L. Jackson's own Jheri curl in Pulp Fiction, years after the look had already fallen out of fashion on real heads, each reference cementing it further into punchline territory rather than the cutting-edge look it once was. Black hair trends shifted hard toward chemical straighteners through the 90s, then swung back toward the natural hair movement in the 2000s and 2010s. A movement built almost entirely around avoiding the harsh chemical process the Jheri curl depended on, and it eventually gave rise to a whole new generation of Black-owned brands built on the opposite promise: ingredients you could actually pronounce, and a curl pattern you never had to chemically alter in the first place. Michael Jackson himself grew his hair out of the style back in 1986, a small sign at the time of just how fast its cultural moment was closing. The wet-look wash-and-wear style that once defined Black pop culture faded into elementary school jokes for kids who'd never even seen one worn in public. The brand's ownership followed a similarly restless path once Cottrell stepped away. Alberto Culver, the company that bought Proline in 2000, was itself acquired by Unilever in 2010, folding Cottrell's old product lines into one of the largest consumer goods portfolios on Earth. A pattern that's since become common across the entire Black hair care industry, where big conglomerates keep buying up Black-owned brands once they grow large enough to notice, the same way Unilever later picked up Shea Moisture and L'Oreal picked up Carol's Daughter. Unilever held on to the ethnic hair care brands for 5 more years before selling them again in 2015 to a company called Strength of Nature, which moved production and kept the core lines running under new ownership, entirely disconnected from the family that built them. The curly kit itself quietly disappeared from that lineage altogether, a product that once generated $10 million in a single year, simply outliving its own cultural moment the way most beauty trends eventually do. Cottrell had built something that made him one of the richest Black entrepreneurs in the country, and the very product responsible for that fortune wouldn't outlive him by more than a decade in any recognizable form, showing that the style a company gets built around rarely lasts as long as the institutions that same company's money goes on to fund. Chapter 7. What he left behind. Comer Cottrell died on October 3, 2014, at his home in Plano, Texas, at the age of 82. He left behind a big, complicated family built across 4 marriages, including his wife at the time of his death, Felicia Starks Cottrell, and children spanning multiple households, among them Renee Cottrell Brown, Comer Cottrell III, Aaron Cottrell, Bryce Cottrell, and Lance Cottrell, along with 9 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild. He'd written his own life story down years earlier in an autobiography, but his real legacy got written into the community itself. By the time he died, his name sat on the boards of the NAACP, the National Urban League, the YMCA, and the Better Business Bureau. He served as a trustee for both Baylor University and Paul Quinn College, alongside leadership roles on the Texas Cosmetology and Youth Commissions. That's a sprawling list of institutions that had nothing to do with hair care and everything to do with community. He treated every single one of those board seats with the same seriousness he once brought to a sales route in Los Angeles. Friends and colleagues who spoke after his death remembered a man who treated his own success like an assignment rather than a reward, a debt to be repaid rather than a prize to sit back and enjoy. He kept working the phones and showing up to board meetings well into his 80s, long past the point where most men in his position would have stepped back and let someone else carry the weight. He was once quoted asking himself directly, "Why have I been given so much, Lord?" answering his own question by deciding he'd been trusted to give back as much as he'd received. That philosophy shows up in how consistently his name reappears attached to other people's institutions rather than his own monuments, a college campus, a mayoral campaign, a business council that had never let a Black man through its doors before him. It's an arc. Wikipedia's own summary of his life still credits as much as the curly kid itself. He described his own guiding principle in equally plain terms, saying he valued the golden rule above every other lesson he'd ever been taught, doing unto others as he would have them do to him. What Comer Cottrell actually built was never really the Jheri curl. It wasn't really a baseball team either. Both were just vehicles. A black entrepreneur from Mobile, Alabama used to move real money into rooms that had never let anyone who looked like him sit at the table before. Long after the curl went out of style, that seat at the table was the part that never went away. It is still visible today on a college campus that carries his name, and in a scholarship fund that answers his lifelong question by paying the tuition bills for the next generation. An $8 box of curl activator built a fortune large enough to buy into Major League Baseball, save a college campus, help elect a mayor, and none of it happens if Cottrell waits around for someone else to notice the gap first. So which part surprised you more, the baseball stake or the college rescue? And should we judge entrepreneurs more by what they build for others than by what they keep for themselves? Drop your answer in the comments. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe to Black Status for more hidden fortune.